In a previous lesson, we learned about the case of HM, the famous neurological patient who had profound memory impairments. In this lesson, we'll ask, why did he have those symptoms? A key concept that we'll encounter is that of system consolidation, that memories are going to be transformed over time and certain brain regions are responsible for this transformation. HM's surgery impaired his ability to do system consolidation. So we'll begin the story with the critical role that the hippocampus plays in memory processing. And we can see its importance when we think about how information is flowing in the human brain. So during the encoding of an experience, psychologists use this word encoding, so we're sort of conscious and aware of what's happening. So we are having a learning experience. So during that experience, the hippocampus integrates information from high-level perceptual areas, forming a memory trace of the experience. And when scientists began to map out the neural circuitry of the cortex, they noticed that the perceptual areas for vision and touch and hearing all sent information down into the hippocampus. So there was a convergence of this perceptual information at the hippocampus. And you'll recall that the back part of the brain, the posterior part of the brain, is sort of answering the question, what is happening? Well, the hippocampus is getting lots of information about what is happening. Now we're going to introduce some icons here, and I've pulled the hippocampus out from underneath the temporal lobe here. So here we have the hippocampus, and here's the cerebral cortex. And we'll introduce this icon here. We've got 3 hippocampal cells, and they're connected by these solid lines. So this will be an icon for an episodic memory trace formed in the hippocampus as a result of that experience, that event. Now, certain hippocampal neurons responded to the experience and formed a memory trace for the episode, and the memory is robust, indicated by the solid lines. Now, notice it's certain hippocampal neurons. There are other hippocampal neurons that did not respond to that particular event. So what we're saying here is then the hippocampus is a critical place where when we undergo some kind of learning event, changes that are happening in the hippocampus to make a memory trace of that event. And the fact that the hippocampus is getting information from all of the different perceptual systems makes good sense. We can see how the hippocampus is integrating that information to make a memory for the event. Now we'll focus up here in the cortex. Notice up here in the cortex, we also have some cortical neurons that responded to the experience. Now, in reality, it would be, visual neurons and touch neurons and hearing neurons. We're just going to let this be the icon for the cortical memory trace. And notice there are dashed lines between these brain cells. This will indicate that this memory trace is weak initially. So the idea here is that during a learning event, the hippocampus makes a strong memory trace, integrating all the information from that event. And the cortex, of course, was processing all that information. After all, it sent it to the hippocampus, but the memory trace in the cortex is weak. Now, this helps us understand some of HM's symptoms. You'll recall he could not make new episodic memories. Well, how could he, right, if he's missing his hippocampus and surrounding medial temporal lobe tissue? So without a hippocampus, there's no place for perceptual information to converge and be linked to form a memory trace. New memories cannot be made. Now let's move on to the next set of events. The idea here is the hippocampus helps to transform a recent memory into a long-term memory stored in the cortex. The cortical memory trace gets stronger. So the hippocampus will be in communication with the cortex in the very same regions of cortex that were processing the original event. And so we'll give this a name. We're going to call this system consolidation, is the post-encoding reorganization of long-term memory over distributed brain circuits, and the distributed brain circuits are hippocampus and cortex. Notice in our picture, we start off, after we just had a learning event, we have a strong memory trace in the hippocampus and a weak memory trace in the cortex. And what system consolidation does is it strengthens the cortical version of the memory, the cortical memory trace. So there is a dynamic relationship, an interaction between the hippocampus and the cortex over time that strengthens the cortical memory trace. And we're calling this system consolidation. It's the process whereby dynamic interactions between the hippocampus and the cortex allow the hippocampus to signal the cortex to store a stronger version of the memory in the long-term memory system. Metaphorically, the hippocampus teaches the cortex to make a hippocampal independent memories, right? To make those kinds of memories. The stronger memory trace involves those cortical regions originally activated by the experience. Now, this idea of consolidation, whereby the hippocampus is in communication with the cortex and helps the cortex make a stronger cortical memory, we're also going to use this to help us understand how episodic memories can be transformed into semantic type memories. So consolidation is a process whereby memory is transformed from a detail-rich and context-specific memory into a more generalized version of the memory that can be integrated with other stored information in the cortex. We call that semantic memory. This is how episodic memories provide the content of semantic memory. Even episodic memories can be transformed into more schematic memories that are hippocampus independent, and we'll see an example of that from HM in a moment. So this process of consolidation not only is reorganizing the memory across different brain systems, the hippocampus and cortex, but it's doing so in a way so as to install new information into the semantic memory store. So in other words, everything starts as an episodic memory when we're in a classroom or we're learning something. But oftentimes we forget the details of the learning experience, yet we have retained information that we learned. Well, that's the semantic memory. So this process of consolidation is also how new information in episodic memory is being integrated into previously stored information, into semantic memory. So the episodic memory involves the hippocampal memory trace, and the idea is the semantic memory is going to be stored in the long-term memory system in the cortex. Now, this idea of consolidation helps us understand another feature of HM's memory impairment. You'll recall he had a gradient of memory recall. Events that happened just prior to the surgery he had very little access to. But when the event was farther back in time, he had better retrieval. And the argument here would be that consolidation takes time. So this process of transforming a memory takes time. So if the event happened right before surgery, there wasn't enough time for consolidation to take place. If the event happened earlier, there was more time for the brain to engage in this memory transformation, the consolidation process. So he had better retrieval for memories farther back in time. It's now time to examine the other feature of HM's memory performance. He seemed to have good recall for events of his childhood. But this was controversial. But first, initially, when scientists saw, oh, he could remember events of his childhood, then an obvious inference presented itself. It seemed as if, even if the hippocampus were removed, other cortical systems, perhaps in the frontal cortex, could reactivate these long-term memories. So the idea then was that the frontal cortex regions reactivate cortical memory traces without the hippocampus. So the hippocampus was not necessary for retrieving long-term memories of his childhood, because clearly he had his hippocampus removed, but he was able to answer questions about his childhood. And initially they thought he was able to answer questions about his childhood because those childhood memories had been consolidated. They had gone through the transformation process and were now accessible without the hippocampus. However, there was controversy surrounding this point, because when his memories were examined more closely, it became clear that HM and others could produce memories of their childhood, but they were schematic and lacking detail and vividness. They could remember that the birthday party involved cake and party games, but the detail of the episode was lost. Perceptual, temporal, and contextual information was absent. So remote episodic memories were different when the hippocampus was damaged. They resembled semantic memories. In other words, only the gist of the episode could be remembered. right? So it's the difference between really reliving that birthday party when you were a kid versus just kind of knowing that, well, there was cake and there were party games and some people were there. So while it seemed that he was able to retrieve these episodic memories from long ago about the stock market crash and taking banjo lessons and shooting target practice in the woods, going roller skating, etc., these could also just be sort of bits of his semantic memory, that he knew he enjoyed doing this type of thing. He didn't really ever remember in detail a particular, time in the woods shooting, but he knew that he did that kind of thing. So that's the difference between having a vivid recollection, an episodic memory, versus a semantic version of that episode. So according to this view called trace transformation theory, HM and others who are missing their hippocampus cannot really recollect and have vivid episodic memories. So the hippocampus must be intact for detail-rich episodic memory retrieval. So on this view then, what HM was doing was reactivating semantic versions of his past. He was not, in a sense, having a detailed episodic memory of his childhood. So for the trace transformation view, it would be the frontal cortex regions can reactivate cortical memory traces without the hippocampus, but, and that's an important but, all that is accessible is semantic memory and a semantic version of episodic memories. And so we see then that HM's memory impairment can be understood by considering the memory processing role that the hippocampus is playing. The hippocampus is a site of convergence for all the information that occurs during a learning event. A memory trace is made in the hippocampus. A weak memory trace is made in the cortex as well. But critically, during consolidation, the hippocampus takes part in strengthening the cortical memory trace. That process takes time. And once that consolidation process happens, then cortical retrieval systems can access those long-term memories without the hippocampus. But the hippocampus is necessary for detailed, context-rich, vivid episodic memories. But this is also our understanding of how episodic memories can provide the content for semantic memory. What's happening in that window of consolidation is that the information that was present in a learning episode is being transformed into semantic memory. We are installing new bits of information into our long-term memory system. And sometimes it's at the price of remembering just where and when we did the learning. So for trace transformation theory, then, the gradient here reflects the time course of memory transformation, whereby episodic memories lose details and become more schematic or semanticized. More remote memories have gone through this transformation, so the cortical representation of remote memories contains general features, the gist of the event, that are independent of context. The hippocampus is required for recreating the detailed and vivid context of an event, so it can be recollected no matter how long ago the memory was acquired. Therefore, without a hippocampus, recent memories cannot be recreated, and there is no cortical representation of the gist of the episode. For remote memories, all that can be retrieved are schematic versions of personal memories. So HM taught us a lot about human memory, that memories undergo a transformation over time. And we'll learn more about how memories are processed in later lessons.